It is my great honor and pleasure to introduce someone who surely needs no introduction, especially if you are a reader of contemporary Indian literature. Chitra Banerjee Divakaruni is an award-winning author, poet, activist, and teacher. She is the author of 19 books, such as Mistress of Spices, Oleander Girl, Before We Visit the Goddess, and Palace of Illusions. Her latest novels are The Forest of Enchantments, a feminist retelling of the epic of the Ramayana in the voice of Sita, and The Last Queen, the story of Maharani Jindan, the indomitable queen regent of Punjab, who fought the British in many ingenious ways. Divakaruni's topics include contemporary life in America and India, women's experiences, immigration, history, and mythology. Her work has been published in over 100 magazines, including the Atlantic Monthly, the New Yorker, Vogue, Elle, Oprah's O Magazine, the Pushcart Prize Anthology, and O. Henry Prize Stories. And her books have been translated into an incredible 29 languages and have been bestsellers nationally and internationally. Her awards include, among others, an American Book Award, a Penn Josephine Miles Award, a Light of India Award, 2 Pushcart Prizes, an Allen Ginsberg Poetry Award, a Rona Jaff Award, a Barbara Deming Memorial Award, and a Houston Literary Award. In 2015, she was included in the Economic Times list of 20 most influential global Indian women, which doesn't surprise me. And 2 books have been made into movies. Several are under option in Hollywood and in India. Arranged Marriage, one of her novels collections has been made into a play and performed in both USA and Canada. She has also, interestingly, she is so multi-talented, written the libretto for the opera River of Light, performed by the Houston Grand Opera and Festival Opera in the San Francisco area. She teaches at the University of Houston, where she is the McDavid Professor of Creative Writing, and also serves on the advisory board of Maitri in the San Francisco Bay Area and Daya in Houston. I have the greatest pleasure in welcoming her, but before I let go, I want to mention one most recent credential award honor. The Last Queen has recently received 2 major awards, the Times of India Author Award for Best Fiction and the International Association of Working Women Best Book 2022 Award. And actually, I would first like to invite in Amber, who is the co-vice president of the International Association of Working Women, to say a few words and present an award to Chitra.
Thank you so much for the introduction. Before I present this award, I would like to thank the DC South Asian Literature Festival for hosting today's event. I would also like to extend a big thank you to both Geeta and Manoj for constantly supporting our organization, as well as for advocating for the rights of women across all industries. So thank you. So Chitra, on behalf of the International Association of Working Women, it gives me the immense honor of presenting you with the award for Best Fiction of the Year for your book, The Last Queen. Congratulations.
Thank you so much. And I have something very exciting to share. The actual award arrived just like 1 day ago. So talk about timing. It's beautiful. I am so honored to receive this award. As a working woman myself, I have great respect for this organization which supports working women. And I want to thank the DC South Asian Literature Festival and Arts Council for making this venue available so that I could share this wonderful award with everyone who's over here looking on. So thank you. Thank you to you. And thank you, Nandini, for this very wonderful and extensive bio. that
You are
you
most
shared
welcome.
with everyone. And thank you for doing this. Thank you for moderating this panel.
It is
Yes,
my
so
pleasure.
congratulations. Like I said, the book was amazing. It was one of those books I just felt like I could not put down.
Thank you so much. And I have to, at this point, like a proud new parent, show everybody this is the Indian cover of Last Queen. It's already out in India. And here, coming out right here, and I see Nandini has that too, is the US cover of The Last Queen. So I am so excited. And, it is my hope that everyone will enjoy this book.
For sure,
Because
definitely.
it does tell an important woman's story, a story that has been forgotten by most people. I mean, I never knew it until I just happened to come across her story.
Mhm. So what inspired you to write the book?
Well, that's part of the mystery of it. So, people often ask me this. They're like, who or how do you how do you see these things? How do these ideas come to you? And I never know. It's always an amazement to me. And this one happened when I went to India for the publication of one of my earlier books. In fact, we will be talking about this book. I'm just trying to find it here. And that is Before We Visit the Goddess. So I went to India to, present, and I was in Calcutta, Kolkata, my birth city, and I walked into the auditorium, and there was the William Dalrymple, the writer, and he was presenting a book on the Kohinoor. And as I walked in, I mean, is this serendipitous or what? He had just put on the screen this painting of Maharani Jinda Kaur.
Mhm.
and and I was just I didn't know anything about her. I knew about her husband, Maharaja Ranjit Singh. I knew about her son, the tragic Dalip Singh, Maharaja Dalip Singh, who was taken away from India by the British, but I did not know about that. And I thought, isn't this, I mean, what could we say? Isn't this what history does to us over and over? They just erase the women out of the stories. And I said, I really want to write about her. And I heard just a little bit about her her connection with the Kohinoor, but then I was just determined that I'm going to research this story and see. And as I researched it, she just spoke to me, and I wanted to share her amazing story with everyone because I know we'll talk about it later. I'll say just one thing, that in that time, in the early 1800s, she was the daughter of a dog trainer at the Lahore fortress, the Lahore Killa, where Maharaja Ranjit Singh, that was one of his killas where he lived. And for her to rise from that very humble background and to become his queen and his favorite queen and his last queen, he never married anyone after her, just made me realize what an amazing person she must have been. Apart from her beauty, yes, she was very beautiful, which never hurts. But he had a lot of beautiful women around him all the time. So her personality, what he saw in her, and I said, I want to bring that out in this book. So that's kind of my backstory for The Last
Well,
Queen.
you
And I'm
did.
just so thankful that everyone is taking to that story. I'm so thankful that people are enjoying
Yes, you did a
her
beautiful
amazing
job.
life. Thank you. And
All
thanks
right,
again
I'll
for
let
this award.
Nandini take over.
Moderator, I am going to exercise my authority, and thank you, Amber, for that, for the award. And it makes us all proud to see Chitra Divakaruni honored and recognized in all the ways that she should be again and again. So, Chitra, if I may, maybe we can just start with having you read something from whichever novel you would like to choose first. And maybe
Okay,
then, if that,
why don't we go to The Last Queen, since we were just talking about it and everyone's in
sure.
that mode? And I will read to you a passage right from the beginning. And the beginning is not the beginning of her life. It's you know, it's an it's kind of a look at a very important moment in her life. So I'm reading from the prologue, and I am going to read the moment This is the moment when Maharaja Ranjit Singh is dying. And this is a moment that's going to change Maharani Jinda's life forever, from being the favorite queen of this very powerful king. Her position will become very tenuous. It'll become very dangerous for her even to live in Lahore. And just to remind everybody, or to tell people if you don't know her story, she's very young. She's in her 20s and, early 20s. And her son, Maharaja Dalip Singh, at that point is just a baby. He's not even 1 year old. And this is happening. This is Lahore, 1839. Jinda hasn't slept for 2 nights now, waiting by the sick bed of Maharaja Ranjit Singh, along with his other wives. They've recited the Guru Granth Sahib until their throats are raw. Birth and death are subject to the command of the Lord's will. He who believes in the name becomes victorious. They've given away their finest Kashmiri shawls, jewels, cows, horses, elephants, sacks of gold coins. Jidda doesn't own as much as the other queens. She came to her marriage empty-handed and has never cared to cajole gifts from her husband. But she too has gifted a triple-stranded gold necklace to the Jagannath temple, hoping for the recovery of the Sarkar, as his people lovingly call him. She kneels on the marble floor, grateful for the stone's coolness, and rests her head against the carved gold bedpost. As the Maharaja's youngest wife and his favorite, she's allowed certain liberties. The other women sit straight-spined, palms joined stiffly. Some of them send her cutting glances from under their veils. She doesn't care. It's stuffy in this room with too much whispering, too many people, Hindustani Vaids, European physicians, the senior courtiers, servants, priests, pankha pullers, and of course the wives, covered from head to foot as custom dictates. Above her head, the canopy bears down, a solid sheet of beaten gold. It oppresses her. Surely it oppresses the Maharaja too. He'd prefer to lie on the roof, she knows, in sight of the stars, as was his pleasure on summer nights. He'd breathe better there, in the open, with the city which he conquered and made his own, stretching out beneath him. The intricate beloved tapestry of Lahore, city of myth, fashioned from the wilderness before time began by Love, son of Ram. But to whom can she say this? Who will listen to her? The power she possessed even a few days ago as the Sarkar's favorite queen has faded. So this is just from the beginning of The Last Queen. And as you can see, she is at a really important, and it's a turning point in her life because indeed she will become very powerless and she'll have to recreate herself to save herself and to save her son, especially, who is, she is just an amazing mother. He becomes the focal point of her life. And she dares to do things that she wouldn't have dared otherwise, just to keep him safe. And as I was reading this, I thought, isn't that what mothers do? The unsung heroes through history, mothers who have given up, who have put themselves in danger, who have done all those things just for their children, in love of our children. And I know, Nandini, you are a mother, as am I, and many of us in the audience are perhaps, that the motherhood brings out something special in us. And I wanted to show that in this historic story about an amazing queen who was a warrior and a mother, and maybe being a mother made her into a more powerful warrior. Nandini,
I
you're
love that
muted.
last comment because I can certainly relate to it myself, and I know that many women and men, I think, across cultures and worlds can understand how you, whoever you are, when your children are at risk or your children are in question, you can be transformed by the urgency of needing to take care of them, to save them. And in some ways, I feel like I want to make maybe a somewhat extended association that as a creative writer, you probably feel the same way also about your work, and you just go to bat when you have a topic that really inspires you. You read all this stuff about Rani Jindan that most of us have never even heard of, had heard of before you wrote about her. And so actually there's a kind of related question in the chat post. I'm wondering if it's okay if I also include the questions
Yes.
that come up from the audience. Okay.
Absolutely.
So Himank was asking, for someone who is just beginning to write himself or is planning to begin creative writing, he wants to know, how do you research before you pen down the first word? Is it that you research as you write, take notes and write in parallel, or first the research completes, then the first words are penned?
That's a great question, and it's especially relevant for a historic novel such as The Last Queen, but also, the mythological novels that I've written, Palace of Illusions, Forest of Enchantments, which required a lot of research into the times of those epics as best as I could. So for me, yes, I have to begin with research because otherwise I won't get a sense of the world, and I won't get a sense of the character, because we are all products of our environment. Even as we create the environment that's around us, we transform our worlds, but our worlds also shape us. So yes, for The Last Queen, I started by doing a lot of research on. Okay, so this was a big challenge. Like I said, history has almost forgotten Maharani Jinda. It's very difficult to get historical texts or texts of history that talk about her. There's a ton of material on her husband, Maharaja Ranjit Singh, who was absolutely a wonderful person. And there's a lot about her son, as I said. I mean, these are books and books written about them, and with photographs, with all kinds of, other material. And that was helpful because it helped me understand the world in which Maharani Jinda was living. And it also helped me understand her place in that world. So I did a fair amount of that. And I was also going to do some travel to the places that had been important to her that were in India, because now some of it is in Pakistan. It would be hard for me to get to. But then COVID hit, so I couldn't do any of that. So I really had to rely on photographs and paintings, which I got off of the internet, to give me a visual sense of those places. And that may have been a good thing, because otherwise, if when you go to a place in modern times, it's been transformed, right? It's not what it was. But when I really focused on those old photographs, I got a sense of the place. So going back to the question, I did all that before I started writing, and that because that gave me enough. I felt like I understood her life enough and the world she was writing in. But then as I wrote, there all kinds of questions came up. So I would make notes, I would continue writing, and then sometimes when that information was very important, I would pause my writing and go and do research. So I would say that my experience has been I do a big chunk of research before I write, but then I continue to do research as I write, and new things come up that I need to know. I need to understand, which I didn't know was going to be in the novel. So I would say it's a continuous process, and don't to all writers out there who want advice, don't let yourself get bogged down in detail, because I could have still been researching Jinda's life. There's always more to research. And then the other thing I would say is, depending on what you're writing, if it's historical, look for some contemporary sources of that time. So I was very lucky to find a whole set of letters and journal entries by various people, including letters that Maharani Jinda had written to the newspapers, and they were published in the newspapers. And she was decrying the unfair treatment of her and her son by the British. By this time, they had imprisoned her. She had to have those letters kind of, you know, carried out surreptitiously and then sent to the newspapers. So, there's so many kinds of research. So the first thing is you have to figure out how much research does your book need and how much of it is historical and contemporary. Then you find out what's the most important thing that you must know before you can start, and then you get started. There'll always be research coming up later.
Thank you. That's such wonderful advice. For the
And just for a moment, I mean, you wrote a historical novel, Love's Garden. Probably you had a similar way of researching.
somewhat, that'll be another discussion, though. I want to focus on you. So, would you like to read from another novel or another part of The Last Queen?
Well, I will go on to this other novel, The Forest of Enchantments. That is, this was a very challenging book to write. I mean, Maharani Jinda's story was challenging, but writing the story of Sita, the heroine of the Ramayana, which is, one of the oldest epics in the world, and which continues to have such an impact on, I would say, the South Asian mind, and even other countries like Indonesia. This epic has continued to have a huge impact, and the characters of Ram and Sita particularly are held up as traditional family. People would, elders would bless me and say, "May you be like Sita." And but they had a whole different idea of who Sita was that I did not agree with. I think in traditional interpretation, Sita is seen as meek and mild and obedient, and she is the perfect follower of Ram. She goes wherever he goes, and she puts up with what happens to her, and she doesn't make waves. And when I always felt that that was not the case, that there was more to Sita than that. And indeed, when I started researching this book by reading many, many versions of the Ramayana, as many as I could get my hands on, I found that that was not true. And in fact, in interpreting the stories, I found that she was a very strong character. The problem with our epics, wonderful books as they are, is that the focus has never been on the women. It's been on the men. It's been on the warriors. It's been on strategy and battle, and even the weapons of the heroes are given more page space than the women in the novel, in the epic. So I wanted to correct that balance a little bit in The Forest of Enchantment. So the entire book is in the voice of Sita. And I'm going to read to you a little bit again. In the prologue, this is almost the end of the story. This is where Sita has now given birth to her two sons, and in the forest, she was banished while she was pregnant, as many of you know the story. She was banished for no fault of her own, and she has given birth to these two children. She's brought them up herself. She's one of the first, I think, probably the first single mother in fiction, and now her children are fairly grown, and she has been living in the ashram of Sage Valmiki. And Sage Valmiki has been writing the story of Ram. It is called the Ramayana. And, like all writers, he wants a little bit of reader response. So he gives the book to Sita and he says, "You would be the perfect person because you know this whole story." And she reads the book and she says, "It's a wonderfully written book, and it has all the right things in it, but hey, you didn't get the story right because you don't know what happened to me when I was alone. You just don't know what I went through." And Valmiki is a very mature writer, so instead of getting upset as most writers would be, he says, "Mother Sita, why don't you write your own story?" And he encourages her to do it. And so that's the scene I'm going to read, where she comes to her room and she finds that Valmiki has sent writing materials for her. I took a deep breath and touched the first palm leaf to my forehead, invoking Saraswati, goddess of creativity, serene on her white swan, though a part of me wondered what she could know of my very human tribulations. I unplugged the ink pot and was startled to see the color the sage Valmiki had chosen for me, red. But of course, how else could I write my story except in the color of menstruation and childbirth, the color of the marriage mark that changes women's lives, the color of the flowers of the Ashoka tree under which I had spent my years of captivity in the palace of Ravan, the demon king. I picked up the quill and closed my eyes. I knew what I must do, travel back to the beginning, to the moment I met Ram, become again the girl I'd been on that day, burnished with innocence, believing that goodness and love were armor enough. That was where I had to start. But as I dipped my quill into the ink pot, they rose inside me, voices, some clamoring, some tentative, some whispering, so that I had to still my breath to hear them. Kaikeyi, second wife of Ayodhya, second queen of Ayodhya, who wrested our throne from us out of blind devotion to her son, only to be hated by him for it. Ahalya, her beauty turned to stone by a husband's jealous fury. Surpanakha, wild enchantress of the forest, whose gravest crime was to desire the wrong man. Mandodari, wife to the legendary demon king, forced to watch her kingdom fall into ruin and her beloved son perish because of her husband's obsession with another woman. Urmila, my sweet sister, the forgotten one, the one I left behind as I set off with blithe ignorance on my forest adventure with my husband. Write our story too, for always we've been pushed into corners, trivialized, misunderstood, blamed, forgotten, or maligned and used as cautionary tales. Yes, I said to them, yes, I'll write your stories as best as I can, for without them, mine can't be complete. I set quill to leaf. In red ink, I began to write, in crooked, effortful letters, because it had been so long since I'd composed anything, the Sitayan. And so, this is the Sitayan. And what Sita says, I think it came from deep inside me also. Why I write women's stories, why I write the stories of these women that I feel are important. Without their stories, ours isn't really complete.
That is beautiful. And I have so many things I want to say and ask, but I think I will at this point privilege the audience and let them ask questions just as you are speaking. Obviously, questions are arising for them. Is that okay?
Yes, you can take questions out of the Q&A and chat, and I'll be happy to.
So there's another question. Can you share experiences from people, especially men who have read your books? I think that's a wonderful question, actually. As your books, surprise, have a strong female character in the center. So I'll just leave it at that. What about the responses of men? And
yeah, so I'll preface this with a question that someone asked early in my career. And, I had two answers, the long one and the short one, but I think the short one is better, so I'll share that one with you. And the question was, who do you write for? And, it was a gender-related question, but also a larger question. And my answer was, I write for women and intelligent men.
that's brilliant.
So, I think I've been very blessed because the men who have read my books have been really positive. They have been so supportive, encouraging, and they have written to me some very touching letters saying, I never knew this, not just about Sita, but about contemporary women. And they have said things like, you have captured my mother's life, you've captured my sister's life. I never understood their inner challenges, but now it has made me much more sympathetic to all the things that they faced and continue to face. They have written things like, I will really not look at a woman the same way again. So it's been very, very moving. And what I love best is quite a large number of them said to me, I bought this book to share it with my mother or my sister or my significant other, and we are reading it together. And that just makes me so happy because I really believe that books are for everyone. I think women readers have known this for a long time, but there's some kind of feeling sometimes among men readers that they should only read one kind of book. And that is very sad because then whole segments of literature are closed to them, things that can really touch their hearts.
Mhm.
So one of my other favorite sayings about writing is from Kafka, and I'll quote. It's not an exact quote, but it's pretty much what he says. And he says, "A book should be an axe to shatter the frozen sea inside us." And I certainly hope, in my small way, my books will do that, that there are portions inside us that are just not, accessible to us. And hopefully books allow them to become accessible. Books change how we feel about the world. They transform us and they transform the world that we see. So I love, love, love. Of course, I love my women readers, but I do appreciate, enjoy, and love the men because we cannot change anything in society, or we cannot change it in the best possible way until the genders come together
Mhm.
and see it as a human situation that needs to be improved.
Thank you. I think I can sort of squeeze in my own question on the heels of that. So one of the things that I would like to know more about is how you determine on the voice of your female protagonist, usually female protagonist. And if I can just add to that, usually I find in the mythical novels that you have written, the historical mythical novels, the voice is at least partly a grieving voice. I'm wondering if you would say something about that, because also to add to that, is the language of grief or even the sort of the register of grief, do you think, eternal? Does it sound the same across centuries and, time? Let's just stick with time, not geographies. Does it sound the same? How do you determine that note, which is so haunting in your narration?
Thank you, Nandini, for saying that. I think you are right in that there is that note of grief, although I hope that it is mixed with notes of triumph and love and joy and all of those things.
Definitely, yes.
But ultimately, it depends on the story, right? These stories, the story of Ramayana, the story of the Mahabharata, and what happens to the women at the end, and the story of Maharani Jinda, although she she is victorious in amazing ways. Ultimately, they are tragic stories. So perhaps in these books, particularly, the voice, the tone is there's a there's a depth of tragedy in the tone. I do think that many of the stories that we are touched by are those moving stories that have pain in them and that show us how do we as human beings deal with pain, overcome pain, because there's just a lot more to learn. I mean, how should we be happy? Yes, I think we need to learn that too, because we have all kinds of wrong ways of trying to be happy. So I hope that my books, my heroines provide some examples of that. But ultimately, one of our deepest problems or issues as human beings is what do we do when the world is just falling apart around us, when my world is falling apart and I have been treated in a way that I think is wrong, and the paths of recourse open to me are few. How do I deal with that?
Mhm.
And therefore, I think these these women are, I hope, I mean, they're certainly for me role models, but very human role models who suffer, role models who make mistakes, but role models who at the end of the day, they stand up and say, I'm not going to give in. And they say, I'm not going to compromise. I think all these three heroines, and many of the others as well. But I think perhaps that's what attracts me to writing about certain characters,
Mhm.
how they deal with this imperfect world, but also they don't compromise their values.
Mhm. Thank you. So maybe we can go on to another novel yet, because we are greedy for you reading.
Okay, well, what I'm going to read from right now is the novel that is most contemporary, which actually, in the end of the novel, it goes into the future. So it's not very, very, not like time machine future, but somewhat into the future. And this is Before We Visit the Goddess, and I will show you the cover of this. Before We Visit the Goddess. This is the US cover. The Indian cover is quite different, and that, is always interesting and, amusing to me how each country decides that they need a different cover. However, Before We Visit this Goddess is the story of three generations of women: a grandmother, Savitri, who lives in India all her life, her daughter, Bela, who comes to the US as an immigrant, and her daughter, Tara, who is born here and lives here in the US all her life. So it is also a story about immigration. It's a story about generational um, I don't know, generational relationships, trauma, communication, lack of communication, changing lifestyles, changing values. And yet, what do we retain? What do we retain as human beings, as women, as people from the South Asian background? These are all some of the questions that are asked in the novel, which is in the voice of these three women. So I'm going to read to you a little bit from the voice of Sabitri. This is Shabitri, as we would call her in Bengal. So this is when Shabitri is going to college. Shabitri it comes from a small village. She comes from a very poor family. In fact, in writing Shabitri's story, I had my mother in mind, although not all the details are there, certainly the background. My mother came from a small village. Her family was not well off. She came to Kolkata to study, to go to college, which was not a very common thing in her generation. And it is not for Shabitri, but her mother has been supportive of her. She's managed to get Shabitri a place to stay at this rich woman's house, this rich woman who's originally from the village but now settled in Kolkata. And Shabitri is kind of, like almost like a poor relation in that house. Well, worse than a poor relation. Even the servants kind of look down on her and are jealous of her. I mean, why does she get to come here and stay? That kind of thing. All right. Meanwhile, the son of the family has fallen in love with Shabitri. Shabitri has fallen in love with her son, with the son Rajiv, and they have been secretly meeting each other up on the terrace of the house late at night. You know, and I'm going to read from this section. Summer had descended upon Kolkata with epic vengeance. Shabitri came back from college, bedraggled with sweat, craving a bath, cold water cascading over her body in the maid's bathroom. But a servant was waiting. Leela Moi, that is the lady of the house. Leela Moi wanted to see her. Shabitri was surprised. Let me drink some water, she said. Change my sari. The woman scrunched up her face and shook her head. Rani Ma's waiting. Better come right now. The first thing she saw when she entered the room was the red quilt from the terrace, crumpled on the floor like the pelt of a dead animal. So this is the quilt that they've taken up to the terrace, and they sit on it, they lie on it, they tell each other the stories of their lives. And she thought nobody knew about it. So here's the red quilt. The blood rushed to her head and then away. She had to hold on to the door frame. When her vision cleared, she looked around for Rajiv, who would defend her. But there was only Leela Moi, and behind her, the servant, Paro, hands on her hips, swollen with satisfaction. From across the years, Savitri remembers Lilamoi's contorted mouth, spitting out invectives. Conniving slut, harlot's daughter, poisonous snake in my bosom. Her own mouth frozen, so that when she tried to say she had done nothing wrong, the words would not obey. She learned that Rajiv had been sent away already to his uncle's home in another city. He would continue his studies there. As for Savitri, she was to leave the house right now. No, Leelamai didn't care where she went or what happened to her. Savitri stood at the tram stop for a long time in the oppressive dusk, carrying her small painted trunk. Finally, she boarded a tram that would take her to the men's college. The men's college is where Savitri has to take all her science and math classes because they don't have them at the women's college. She could think of no other place. She opened her handbag, so light, and looked down at the frighteningly few rupee notes in there. Her trunk was light too. Paro had followed her to her room and rummaged through it, saying, "Let's see what you're stealing," and taken the silk saris that Lilamoi had given her. She'd taken some of Savitri's own things as well, a buffalo horn comb that her mother had given her, a tiny bottle of rose water Savitri had saved up for months to buy. Savitri had been too heartsick to protest. The men's college loomed eerily in the gloom. She slipped through the gate, thankful that the gateman wasn't there to stop her, and ran up the stairs. On the second story, at the end of a corridor, there was a small room with a plaque on it, Women's Common Room. She had gone there once, exploring, with her friends. It was piled with dusty furniture and smelled of mice droppings. But there was a bolt on the inside and a small toilet. She could stay there for the night. Tomorrow, she couldn't handle the thought of tomorrow yet. When she reached it, the door to the common room was padlocked. The strength went out of her, and she slid to the floor, unable to hold in her sobs any longer. Terror and rage, but foremost was the fear of what might happen to her tonight when the night watchman came by. Would he throw her out on the street? Would he do worse? Beneath it all roiled the humiliation. What would her parents, her relatives, her village say if they knew she had been kicked out of the Mittir home like a dog? No one would care that the love she and Rajiv had felt for each other was pure and beautiful. Good daughters are fortunate lamps, brightening the family's name. Could she have strayed any further from that old saying? She had been weeping too hard to hear the footsteps. When she felt a hand on her shoulder, she flinched and cried out, throwing up her arms to protect herself. But it wasn't the night watchman, as she had feared. And I'm going to end right there. Wickedly, so people will have to read to see who it was that puts a hand on her shoulder. So that is a dramatic moment from Savitri's story that shows, some of the very difficult things that she has to go through in her life.
And they will be well rewarded when they read on, as I can vouch. I also just love the way that you capture her interiority, her internal monologue. And it would be difficult to do that without, at least for me, I think, without descending into something mawkish. But you keep it at this truly psychologically very credible and yet very intense level. So again, thank you for showing us how that is done and for allowing us to read it when it's been done. I do have...
Thank you for reading. Thank you for, noticing that.
Always.
The voices are always very important for me. I spend a lot of time on voice before I privilege voice. In fact, there was an earlier question on um, research. Research is important, but for me, voice is even more important. Until I get the voice, I can't write. I'll just rewrite the beginning until I get that voice right. Sometimes I keep rewriting it for a long time.
I do see other questions from the audience members, so maybe I need to turn it over to them. There's a question from Anita Nahal. My reading of Palace of Illusions revealed to me that you very eloquently address issues of feminism, women to women equations, conflicts, male domination, and societal injunctions, especially on women. How are you able to present the personal and the public in your novels? What kind of detachment do you creatively employ? Wonderful.
Wow, that's a great question and a challenging one. And I have to say that all the distance that I have from the story, the distance is before I start writing. So I think about things, I analyze them in my mind, I think about themes and topics. And, in the story of Draupadi in the Palace of Illusions, moments when she was, wronged, for instance, when she is pulled into the sabha, into the court, and she's going to be disrobed. The Shasan is pulling on her clothes. I mean, talk about harassment, talk about humiliation, talk about a violence done to her. It's one of the earliest examples of that in literature. So, so all the things that I thought about it, I thought it. But once I start writing, I am in the character's voice, I am in the character's persona, and I only stay there. What would she have thought? What did she learn about it from that experience? And because I'm in her head completely and honestly, whatever comes out, I mean, I've done all the other thinking before, but whatever comes out then comes out dramatically and not like me, you know, pontificating on what I believe. It's from there on, from word number one, it is the vision of the woman, it is the feeling of the woman, it is what is true to her. Even if I, Chitra, would not agree with what she decides or does. And there were times in all of these novels where the women do things that one part of me is like, don't do it, don't do it. But I know that that character would do it. And I have to stay honest with that. I have to have that much respect for the autonomy of my characters. So that's really, really important for me. Otherwise, I think, especially because I do write about a lot of issues, both immigrant issues, women's issues, issues about violence, poverty. I write about these things, they're important. They would become heavy handed. But because I approach them only through the characters, I hope that I am able to avoid that trap. For example, what Draupadi, or Panchali as she's called in the Palace of Illusions, what she's going to learn at the end of that disrobing scene, that foiled disrobing scene because she is helped divinely. But what she learns is something that we can all learn with or without, supernatural help. And she learns, and this came very deeply from inside of her. But when she said it, I was like, yes, yes. And she says, why should I feel ashamed when a violence is done to me? They are the ones who should be ashamed. And then she just stands up straight and she's like, do what you want. You're not going to get to me that way. And I felt when those words came, they were her words, but then they resonated in me. And and they resonated and went beyond that scene because victim shaming has been such a big problem for women down the ages, continuing now. But if I had approached that scene from like victim shaming, I'm going to show how that's a bad thing, would never have worked. I could only approach it through Panchali's character.
Yes, I agree with that. And I have a question. I think I will let though the next question in the audience have its play, and then if there's time remaining, I will ask another question that I have. Alvina Brueggemann asks, when you start writing, do you start with a single character's arc, or does the entire plot, and maybe in some ways you have answered some part of these questions, but does the entire plot structure come to you all of a sudden? How do you start and develop your novels? Would you care to address that?
Yeah. All right, every writer has their strengths and their weaknesses. And I'll confess right here, character is my strength. Plot is my weakness. I am not good
I
with
would
plot.
never know that.
So so I have to work a lot on plot. And generally, I mean, that's why I loved writing like Mahabharata and the Ramayana, because the plot was laid out for me. And in many ways, the last queen also, I know from the beginning what's going to happen to her. How it's going to happen is what I will show. And what is the effect on her is what I will show. But at least, thank God, the plot is out there already. So I start, but when I'm creating my plots, like with before we visit the goddess, which is my own plot, I have to spend a lot of time on it, and I don't know in the beginning how it's going to end, right? I know how it's going to begin. I know the problems with which, or the challenges with which the characters will start, but I have to kind of get into the novel somewhat before I know how it's going to end. So, and there usually comes a magic moment in my writing when, right from the beginning, I know the conflicts, the challenges, the problems, but I don't know the resolution. But there comes a magic moment when I can see to the end, to the resolution. And then I stop everything I'm doing and I make an outline. I make a plot, like, because I'm like, get this, I might never remember it again. So that's how I approach plot. Different people approach plot in very different ways. I would say, in general, as I've been writing, though, the importance of an outline has become more and more crucial to me. So, at a certain point in the book, I will outline the rest of the book.
Well, we are running out of time, so I think maybe I have a couple questions that I could ask. Do we
Yes,
get?
I want to hear your questions, Nandini.
Yes, I've been trying to be unselfish and give our listeners a pride of place. But my question, among others, one is, I was at some point, I at some point suddenly noticed that I have read all your books, and I noticed that whereas you started with sort of individual fictional characters experiencing gender issues, I think largely kind of social issues, social gender politics. I think Palace of Illusions was maybe your first book where you visibly made a shift to myth and history, or myth as history or history as myth. Could you say what led to that? How did you suddenly, or maybe not suddenly, but how did you start writing work that was more of a kind of universal knowledge and import nature?
Good question. So I think I've been thinking about Panchali, Draupadi,
Yeah.
for a long time, and Sita. And I really wanted to write their stories. But I just didn't have, A, I didn't have the courage, and B, I didn't have the ability. Because, for me, writing in first person contemporary stories is just easier. It's a world I know so well. And writing about these great women was a scary thought. So I think I started doing the research as I was writing my other novels. I started researching the Palace of Illusions. I started researching, and then I just got inspired. But boy, it took me a long time to find Panchali's voice. I did a lot of rewriting of that first chapter. So it is a project that I had in mind for a long time. And I think I just needed to learn the fictional techniques that would allow me to write that novel. I did a lot of rewriting as well.
Right.
through that novel.
It was not something that maybe happened because of a contemporary social or political situation. It had already been incipient for you, the
Yes.
desire to write.
And the political situation that had been incipient is what I talked to you about, is that people are always telling the woman's story, and not allowing her her own voice, pushing her to the corner of the canvas and putting the importance on other things. And the woman's story is kind of just by the way, and it's often a male interpretation of that story, even as it is presented, not just because a man is writing her story, but as it is presented in the book. The book itself has a male gaze. The narrator of the book often has the male gaze, and the woman is just an object of that gaze. So that had been my project for a long time. So to bring that project to its rightful complication, I wanted to use a story that would be known to many, many people, and that people would feel already strongly, and they may even have preconceptions. I mean, one of the preconceptions of Draupadi is, well, there are many preconceptions, but one is that she caused the Mahabharata war. Oh, that woman,
It's
she
always
is
the
the
woman.
cause of all that death and devastation. No, she was not the cause of Mahabharata war. She may have played a part in it, but you cannot blame her for it. And I hope I've shown the multiple important reasons for war. So, that I think kind of writing the story, RIGHT, was an impetus for writing the story, WR. Right?
That is so well put. Well, we are almost at the end of time, I think. So I will reluctantly, I think, have to let you go because I had so many more questions. But is that correct, organizers? Are we ending right at 12?
Yes, I believe we're almost at the end of time here. So really appreciate all your time. Thank you for joining us. But yeah, we'll keep the conversation going. It's this is a literary festival, so we just want to make sure that the conversation goes on.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So,
and I just want to tell people before I end that I am very available to readers on my social media, so people can write to me on Twitter and on Facebook and even on Instagram. I will answer questions as best as I can. I love hearing from readers, and I just wanted to end by saying a big thank you to the festival organizers. And I think it's really important to keep things running at the right.
Thank you
Yes.
again, Chitra. What a wonderful.
Thank you, Nandini. You were such a wonderful interlocutor. It's great to have a fellow writer talking to me.
awesome. So with that, I just wanted to quickly end this event. Thank you for onboarding on our journey, everyone from the epic characters, ma'am Sita, through Panchali, through Rani Jindan, through Shabitri, Bella, and Tara. I think it's just a timeline, which follows through amazing characters that you portray in your books. And as I said, this conversation will go on, and we'll read more of Professor's amazing books. I just want to quote from one of your books. I am buoyant and expansive and uncontainable, but I always was so, only I never knew it. A beautiful thought from your book, ma'am, Palace of Illusions. Thank you for keeping us engrossed in your books, and appreciate all the time. Congratulations on your award. But at the end of it, just want to say namaste, adab, and see you all through all the attendees. And do not forget to register for our events throughout the coming week, and have a great rest of your day, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.